Hello everybody and welcome back to another edition of Wildcard MTG and an EDH deck tech. This time we are covering Niko, Light of Hope. I know if you watched the last video I said I wasn't very inspired by too many of the Duskmourn commanders, but after messing around with this one on Arena a little bit, I changed my mind. This card is kind of freaking crazy. So that is the card I chose for this deck tech video, and there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this commander. So let's get into it. So let's look at what the commander does. Niko, Light of Hope is a 2 generic white-blue commander. He's a human wizard. It says when Niko, Light of Hope enters, create 2 shard tokens. They are enchantments with pay 2, sacrifice an enchantment, scry 1, then draw a card. And then Niko's second ability says pay 2 and tap, exile target non-legendary creature you control. Shards you control become copies of it until the beginning of the next end step. Return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So we need to get in some rules text here because of like the shard tokens and how Niko works and what that means, because that ability is a little different. You know, yes, you are going to be getting ETB triggers off the creature coming back in, but the shard tokens, because they're already on the battlefield, you are not going to get ETB triggers off of those. But the fact that these shard tokens are enchantments is kind of nuts, and we'll get into that in a minute. So let's get into some of the deck stats of Niko. So the first thing we're going to look at here is our mana spread of the deck. So we have 55% of white mana, which is 53% of all the symbols on the deck, and our white mana production is 66%. So we're pretty solid there with our mana curve and what we need to spend mana on. The blue mana in the deck is 49%, which is 47% of all the symbols, and our blue mana production is 66%. So again, way above curve on both those things. We should have no problem with either color in this deck. There's 11% colorless symbols, but that isn't really entirely relevant because there's a couple X spells in the deck. We're not really too invested in those, but it is a mana percentage, so we need to look at it. And so first up here, we're going to look at our 1-drops. We are running 7 1-drops, and we have 1 sorcery, 5 instants, and 1 artifact, and we have a 97.41% chance of playing those on curve. And our 2-drops, we are running 19 of them, so this is the bulk of our deck. If you haven't noticed by now, I run pretty low mana value decks and everything like that, but we were running 4 creatures, 10 instants, and 5 artifacts, and we have an 89.46% chance of playing those on curve. In our 3-drop slot, we have 3 creatures, 6 instants, 1 artifact, and 4 enchantments, and we have a 75.94% chance of playing those on curve. In our 4-drop slot, we have 8 creatures, 1 sorcery, and 2 instants, and we have a 59.22% chance of playing those on curve. So that's where the bulk of our creatures come from, and that's where like all of the value creatures are, but we will get into that in a later section of this deck tech. And then finally, for our 5-drops, we have 7 creatures, and we have a 42.51% chance of playing these on curve. The good thing about these creatures is most of them are value creatures, and we should be able to play them on curve, especially if they are the win cons. And then our 6-drops, we have 1 Plainswalker, 2 creatures, and 1 sorcery, and we have a 28.21% chance of playing those on curve. We have 1 7-drop. It's a creature. We have a 17.41% chance of playing that on curve. Our 8-drop is an enchantment. And we have a 10% chance of playing it on curve. But I think, you know, it's just a win more card. It's not necessarily vital to this deck. You know what I mean? Don't worry about it too much. It's just a good card in the deck. So one more thing I want to get into before we get into the creatures and everything else about this deck is some more rulings with the deck, and as far as like flicker and exile effects kind of go, because it can be kind of confusing, especially with the exile effects, because one thing we want to try to do with this deck is to blink our commander a bunch of times, but the problem is when we do that, when Niko enters the battlefield again, they're going to have summoning sickness, so we cannot activate their ability after that flicker effect to get more of the shard tokens. So we're probably going to be wanting to blink Niko in our second main phase after combat in order to get more shard tokens for the next time around. But that will vary based on what we have on the battlefield, because there are some things we have that can give Niko haste. So some of the rulings, as you can see on the screen, thanks to MTG Wiki, says a permanent that returns to the battlefield after being exiled does so as an entirely new object. It will have no memory of or connection to its previous existence. So that means if you put a +1/+1 counter on it, any kind of counter really, when it comes back to the battlefield, it will not have that counter. It will have summoning sickness, like I mentioned, so it cannot do the thing that you want it to do, so keep that in mind. Unless an effect says otherwise, permanents enter the battlefield untapped. Creatures can't attack or tap until they've been continuously under your control since the start of your most recent turn, and double-faced cards enter the battlefield with their front face up. So those are some rulings to think about with flickering and how you want to kind of play and run the deck. So let's get into a little bit how to pilot the deck before we get into everything else. You know, Niko has a pretty unique design, and that's what I was not really looking at when I first kind of looked at the card. I was kind of like, oh, it's just a generic blink deck. You're going to, you know, pop stuff in and out of the battlefield, get all those value triggers. But then when I figured out what the shard tokens did, I was going to use an expletive there, but I'm trying to keep it clean for you guys. When I figured out what the shard tokens did and the value that you could get off like having like 10, 12 shard tokens on a battlefield, that's when I realized like, oh wow, this card is kind of cool and not necessarily busted. You get a lot of value out of it. Let's just put it that way. So the game plan with this deck is to blink Niko as much as possible so you can make a ton of shard tokens, turn them into super value engine attack trigger creatures. And, you know, the other thing with this deck is you really have to play it a lot like a control deck in order to really maximize the flicker and exile spells, as well as how the removal and the tempo package in the deck works, because there's a lot of things that will bounce creatures to your hand or bounce creatures to your opponent's hand. And having that tempo, you know, especially with blinking Niko, like I mentioned, that's in their tempo thing, you kind of have to keep that in mind when playing this deck. So definitely look out for that. And I'll get into the nuts and bolts of it a little more at the end when we're talking about win cons. So the first thing we're going to look at here real quick, we have two Plainswalkers in this deck. The first is the original Niko. They are good for making even more shard tokens. Obviously, you want to have the original Niko. If possible, we want to put as much into the X ability of this Plainswalker cost to gain at least 3 or 4 shards from the cast. Even if it's 1 or 2, that's still fine. We're getting more shards out of it. But the good thing is, if Niko sticks around, really every other turn we should be doing the +1 to do his effect, and then do the -1 to make the shard tokens, so that we can kind of like keep him on the battlefield. It just depends on like if people are trying to attack the Niko or not. If they're not, you want a +1, -1, +1, -1, do it back and forth like that to really get the most value out of that Plainswalker. And then the other one running in the deck is the Eternal Wanderer. She serves 2 purposes in the deck. Number 1, she is a board wipe on a Plainswalker immediately. Her -4 allows us to wipe the board. We get to keep 1 creature, which is obviously going to be our commander if it's out. If not, we just want to keep the most valuable creature that we can blink or copy into shard tokens with Niko eventually. And then we also have a repeatable blink effect on her with her +1, which is what we are going to want to use the most in order to blink Niko quite a bit, or any other value creatures we have on the battlefield like Muldrifter, etc. So real quick, let's look at what creatures we're using for the deck. We have 24 creatures, and they are Abuelo, Ancestral Echo, Angel of Destiny, Brago, King Eternal, Charming Prince, Curiosity Crafter, Dowerport Mage, Dream Trawler, Enduring Curiosity, Eternal of Harsh Truths, Gandalf the White, Gene Stealer Patriarch, Herald of Faith, Hero of Bladehold, Muldrifter, OG the Exquisite Blade, Silent Hall Creeper, Silverwing Squadron, Soul Herder, Spirited Companion, Thassa Deep Dwelling, 20-Toed Toad, Wind Reader Sphinx, Wingmate Rock, and Yorion Sky Nomad. Now, our blink package of creatures to either blink our commander or the value creatures we have in the deck are pretty obvious. You know, they're Yorion, Thassa, Soul Herder, Brago, OG, and Abuelo. So those cards are really the cards we're going to use to keep blinking either our commander or whatever value creatures we have on the battlefield. So that way we can get some kind of card draw, life gain, more shard tokens, whatever it may be. You know, the other thing is too, like, even within those creatures, we can blink OG himself because he scries 2 and gains us 2 life. We want to be blinking things like Spirited Companion, Mole Drifter, you know, ETB kind of effects if Niko is not out on the battlefield. Now, the creatures that we want to turn our shard tokens into are the ones that give us attack trigger values. This is the big part of the deck. The way that we're building this deck is to turn all of our shards into these creatures that when they attack, we get so much value off them because they are non-legendary, so that's a cool thing, but they do something crazy when they attack, or something, you know, good when they attack. Now, the creatures we want to turn those tokens into are cards like Wind Reader Sphinx, because it lets us draw a card for each card with a creature that's flying, which if we turn all of our shard tokens into the Wind Reader Sphinx, they all have flying, so we're going to draw a freak ton of cards off that. Same thing with Dream Trawler. Each of those Dream Trawlers are going to get +1/+0 for each other creature that's attacking, and each card we draw, Wingmate Rock is going to gain us life, and then also we're going to make a 3/4 token off that one. Angel of Destiny is one of the win cons, which we're going to get into a little later. We will gain life off that card. Genestealer Patriarch is super interesting in that if we attack with it, we're going to put these infection counters on target creatures defending player controls. And then whenever those creatures with an infection counter on it dies, we will create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a Tyranid in addition to his other types, which is not really relevant, but we can make copies of people's commanders, big crazy creatures they have, big value creatures, whatever it may be. Pretty underrated card in my opinion in this deck. It's only like 11 cents. Yes, the mana value of it is pretty high, but if you can get those attack triggers even just for one run, that's probably going to give you more value in the long run. One of the MVPs of the deck is one of my favorite cards for this deck, and it is Eternal of Harsh Truce. It's 2 generic, 1 blue, creature zombie cleric, and it has Afflict 2. Whenever this creature becomes blocked, defending player loses 2 life. And then it also has whenever Eternal of Harsh Truce attacks and isn't blocked, draw a card. So you're giving whoever you're attacking a double-edged sword of a choice. Either they're going to not block it and take 1 damage, and then you're going to draw a bunch of cards, or they're going to block all of the creature token copies from the shard tokens, and they're going to take 2 damage for each of those that they blocked. And then, you know, if they have something that's bigger than a 1/3, fine, they're probably going to die, but it's a good, interesting choice. I really like this card in this deck. It's probably the card I like the most, especially with that Afflict 2 and the draw card thing. And also the rate, a 1/3 is pretty good, I think. If you have a way to get this card to not be blocked, which there isn't really in this deck, to be fair, but the fact that you're going to be like turning all your shard tokens into this creature, you're still going to get the attack triggers, so the person you're attacking is going to have to choose, and that's why this card's so good in my opinion, especially for an uncommon or from Hour of Devastation, and it's only like 7 cents. So this is like my MVP pick of this deck in my opinion. It's a really cool card. So that's all the creatures and their synergies within the deck. Let's talk about the sorceries real quick. We're only running 2 sorceries, not a whole lot. We have a splash portal, which lets us blink something, but at sorcery speed. And then Spectral Deluge is really just a sorcery speed Aetherize. I know it doesn't seem as good, but you want to play it for the foretell cost, so that way later on in the game, if you need to go in for an alpha strike on somebody, you can play this foretell card. All their creatures are going to get put back into their hand because you're probably going to have at least 5, 6, 7 islands, who knows. However many islands you have at that point, you're probably going to have enough to bounce their whole board back to their hand, strike in for lethal, or at least enough to really mess them up. They will have to replay all this stuff on their next turn. Yes, it's not as good to Aetherize, but you can play it before you go to combat, so that's why it's kind of better, because Aetherize wants people to be attacking you. This lets you preemptively do it to somebody before you're going to attack them, so that's why I think this card's pretty good for this deck. And now let's get into the instance, which we are running 23. This is another big bulk of the deck. This is why I say you have to play it like a control deck, because there are a ton of instant cards in this deck. We are running Aetherize, Blur, Cloud Shift, Cosmic Intervention, Disorder in the Court, Displace, Eerie Interlude, Ephemerate, Ghostly Flicker, Long River's Pool, Momentary Blink, Negate, Parting Gust, Path to Exile, Planar Incision, Radiant Purge, Rootborn Defenses, Semester's End, Slip on the Ring, Snap, Sphinx's Revelation, Swords to Plowshares, Teferi's Time Twist, and Unwanted Remake. So this deck runs a lot of flicker type effect cards. In total, we're running 11. So at this point, there's really no reason to list every single one because they all do the same thing, but you can see the list on the screen, obviously. You know, sitting here going through every single one is not going to do anything. They all do the same thing, where it's like you're going to blink it, the thing's going to come back on your end step, you're going to get value out of that creature. Presumably, you want to be doing it to Niko, in my opinion. Now, one card I do specifically want to talk about or call out here is a new card from Bloomburrow, which is Parting Gust. It's almost kind of like a dual spell in that it can be removal for a creature if we give the gift, and if we don't, we can just blink one of our own creatures to get the value to make more shards from Niko or Muldrifter, whatever we want to blink. But if we give the gift, we can remove a creature for 2 white, it exiles it, it's gone. It's like Swords to Plowshares, all that kind of stuff. So it's either removal or a blink spell. I love that card does that. It's so cool. The give the gift thing is not a big deal because it's a tapped fish, so you're going to give somebody a tapped 1/1, no big deal. Now, we also have a package of cards that can save our board from board wipes. You know, this is another reason we kind of have to play this deck in a more control style, because we need to leave mana open for spells like Eerie Interlude, Semester's End, and Cosmic Intervention to really save our board and to also get extra value out of the blink style effects from those creatures once those spells resolve, and then all the creatures come back to the battlefield, because they're all going to come back, and you can choose how they come back and how the blink effects stack. So you really have to take that into account when you're playing the spells, but they're also really, really good for saving from board wipes, so keep that in mind. Also, even target removal. If you have a creature you're like, man, I really don't want this thing to die, and you don't happen to have like a lower mana value blink spell at the time, but you have like an Eerie Interlude or something, you can just use that Eerie Interlude on that one creature and it will save it. So keep that in mind as well. And our artifacts, we're running 7. We have an Azorius Signet, Crystal Shard, Inquisitorial Rosette, Soul Ring, Swiftfoot Boots, Talisman of Progress, and Thought Vessel. Pretty simple artifact mana rock package. 2 cards I really want to touch on real quick is Inquisitorial Rosette first. This card is from the 40k decks. It's a 2 generic artifact equipment, and it says whenever equipped creature attacks, create a 2/2 white Asterities warrior creature token with vigilance that's attacking, and then attacking creatures gain menace until end of turn. So presumably and it has an equip cost of 3, not to get ahead of myself there. So presumably you want to attach this to one of the tokens once they come onto the battlefield, and then after that, when you go to attack, all of those tokens are going to have menace. We don't even really care about making the 2/2 warrior creature token, honestly. You really just want to attach this to something that's going to attack, so then all those creatures gain menace, so it's going to be harder to block them. Yes, 5 mana in total, but if you play this on an early turn and then equip it later on, It's gonna gain you so much value just off that menace. And then finally, the Crystal Shard. This actually was kind of like a weird last-minute addition to this deck. I was listening to the new episode of Shivam and Wheeler Love Magic. I've had this card sitting around for a long time, and the fact that it's a 3-mana artifact that says pay 3 tap or blue tap, return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. Yes, you can bounce something on somebody else's board, but you can also bounce your own commander back to your hand, which is realistically what we are going to want to do with this, and it's only going to cost us a blue mana. Pretty cool card for that effect, and it is repeatable, so unless they destroy the Crystal Shard, it's going to stick around and we can keep bouncing whatever we need back to our hand, so keep that in mind. I was looking for more like bounce spells when I was building this deck, being like, okay, if we can't do this, let's get Niko back to our hand. And this is kind of a repeatable one on an artifact. And man, when they were talking about that card, it just clicked, and I was like, holy shit, I know where this card needs to go. So thank you, Shivam and Wheeler. I doubt you're listening to this, but awesome addition to this deck. And then finally, we are running 5 enchantments. They are Candlekeep Sage, Far Traveler, Ghostly Prison, Legion Loyalty, and Touch the Spirit Realm. Now, Candlekeep Sage and Far Traveler are blink synergies, so to speak. Candlekeep Sage lets us draw a card every time our commander leaves the battlefield, and then Far Traveler lets us choose a thing to blink at the end of the end step. Obviously, you all know what Ghostly Prison does. Legion Loyalty, this is the win more card that I was talking about. If we happen to get this out and play it, and we have all those, let's just say magical Christmas Land, we have like 5, 6, 7 tokens attacking. Well, guess what? All those tokens now gain myriad, so they're going to make one more token for each other player, and you're going to get so many more insane triggers off that. And again, I don't know if this is even possible. I have yet to even play it. But it's a good include if you're really trying to just win the game. Now, Touch the Spirit Realm. This is a cool card from Kamigawa. It's an enchantment, 2 generic 1 white. It says when Touch the Spirit Realm enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature until it leaves the battlefield. So it is like a prison type effect, and that you can take something away if you need to. But the channel ability, this is where this card's really cool. 1 generic and 1 white, you can discard Touch the Spirit Realm, then exile target artifact or creature, return to the battlefield. It's a blink card, but on an enchantment because of that channel effect. And the cool thing about channel is it cannot be interacted with. So you can channel this card, blink your commander or whatever you need to blink at that time, and nobody can do anything about it. And then also, if you just need to get something off the battlefield that, like I said, enchantment removal is hard to come by. So if somebody's not running a lot of enchantment removal and you need to get something problematic off the battlefield, this is another way to do that. So it's a cool dual kind of card in that respect. I really, really like this card for this deck. So definitely keep an eye out for this card in the deck. And then we are running 35 lands, nothing crazy here. As it, again, with my mana bases, I try to keep them budget. I don't put a ton of like fetch lands and shock lands and all that kind of stuff in decks. It's not really my thing. You don't need them. There's so many utility lands at this point. Find other alternatives for those cards. There's so many good cards like for lands now. But it is on the screen when I'm running in this deck. And so let's get into the pros of the deck. The deck can generate a ton of value off of attack triggers. With like cards like Wind Rider Sphinx, if that attacks and you have like 4, 5, 6 shard tokens out, you're going to be drawing 4, 5, 6 cards off those shard tokens because all those creatures have flying. And if you just happen to have another creature out that has flying along with it that's not attacking, boom, there's another card. And then obviously the Wind Rider Sphinx doesn't have an ETB effect, but when it comes back into the battlefield, if it did, you would get that effect off of Niko blinking it. Shard tokens being enchantments is huge value. If these were artifacts, I would say this deck would be a little bit more susceptible to getting blown out, but the fact that these are enchantments, there's not a ton of cards, unless you're playing in a very white board wipey, removal heavy meta, you're probably going to be, your shard tokens are going to be fine. You know, things like Austere Command and Cleansing Nova and Farewell are obviously going to screw you over. And I know Farewell is pretty prevalent in the meta, unfortunately. I hate that card. But I think overall, you're going to be fine. These shard tokens are going to be pretty darn resilient. So it's a matter of keeping those value creatures on the battlefield in some way. And also, like I mentioned, the deck is resilient to board wipes. So if you have people in your meta that are just playing a bunch of board wipes and your creatures are going to get blinked and your creatures are going to get destroyed, well, you can blink them in response to a board wipe with something on your battlefield. And that's why you have to play this deck as a control deck. You need to leave mana open to blink creatures when you need to, unless you're trying to get value out of Niko. You know, you can even blink Niko on somebody's end step or before their end step, and when their end step occurs, Niko is going to come back, and then when it gets to your turn, Niko will be fine. Stuff like that. You have to play really control-y with this deck, and that's fine. It's kind of fun that way because you have to really think about what's going on the board. And then also the deck has a pretty solid amount of interaction to stop problem cards or save our creatures from removal, and also to counter spells. I didn't get too much in counter spells in this deck, but there are quite a few. You kind of have to play the deck this way, unfortunately. And then we also have some token generators to have blockers when the shards stop being copies of creatures, which leads into some of the cons of the deck. One of the biggest cons of the deck is that the shards, after you've attacked with them, the shard tokens go back to being shards after combat, so they are not going to be creatures anymore, and that leaves you wide open for crackback. It does kind of suck, but if you're generating a bunch of tokens off those attack triggers, because we do have a few creatures that do that, that will help you have blockers open for the crackback on that stuff. But keep that in mind that, like, if you don't have a ton of creatures out and you're just trying to draw cards, dig or something like that, but you only have like 1-2 creatures, but then you have like 12 shards or something like that, well, at the end of combat, all those shards are going to go back to being shards. They're not going to be creatures, so you're going to have no blockers after that. And something like I mentioned early on, you know, blinking Niko kind of messes with tempo a little bit, because when Niko returns to the battlefield, they're going to have Summoning Sickness to activate the ability, so that won't be possible. But yeah, you'll get the ETB of making the shard. So you really have to think about blinking Niko either at the end of somebody's turn or in your second main phase after combat. You know, something to get the value off of it where you've already turned the shards into something. And that's another thing to think about too, is if you need to block, you can pay the 2, tap Niko, turn all your shards into a bunch of blockers if you don't really want to get the attack triggers. So those are a couple of the pros and cons of the deck. How do we win with this deck? Well, first up is a new card from Bloom Burrow, and that's 20-Toed Toad. It's 3 generic 1 blue creature frog wizard. Your maximum hand size is 20. Whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, put a +1/+1 counter on 20-Toed Toad and draw a card. Whenever 20-Toed Toad attacks, you win the game if there are 20 or more counters on it, or you have 20 or more cards in hand. So this sounds kind of convoluted to pull off, but realistically, if you were attacking with 5-6 copies of 20-Toed Toad that your shards got turned into, they're all going to get the +1/+1 counter from that attack trigger. They're all going to draw cards from that. And finally, the second win con in this deck is Angel of Destiny. And hoo boy, let me tell you about this card. 3 generic 2 white, creature, angel cleric, flying, and double strike. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player each gain that much life. Doesn't sound too good, right? Well, at the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 life more than your starting life total, each player Angel of Destiny attack this turn loses the game. I cannot tell you, I have a cleric tribal deck with this card in it. I cannot tell you how many times this card has won me the game because people do not pay attention to what it does. They're like, oh, you swing at me for 4 damage and I gain 4 life, so I don't actually lose the life, but I'm sitting at like 56 life, so I'm like higher than what I was before, and then I win the game because I attacked them with it. Now imagine making 5, 6, 7 copies of this card and attacking all your players at once, and you're sitting at like 50, 60 life. You can wipe out the whole table with this one card. This card is so cool. This card is so freaking underrated, I swear. People do not see it coming. I've won so many games with this card in my cleric's deck. to the point now where, like, if I bring it out, people know what it does finally. They've lost to it enough times to be like, oh no, we need to kill that immediately. But think about making token copies of it with this deck. They can't get rid of everything, so keep that in mind. This is one of the main win cons with this deck. Angel of Destiny, super underrated card, super awesome card. I love this card so much. And then finally, you know, really just overall with the deck, this deck is pretty aggro. You know, through general combat, we are going to whittle down most of our opponents. Yes, a lot of the creatures that we want to be attacking with are very high mana value, but once you get all the attack trigger value out of those creatures, it's not really going to matter, because we do have actually quite a bit of life gain in this deck too that we didn't really go over too much, but it's in the deck list. So we're resilient enough that we could like sustain a life total to keep ourselves in the game from more aggro style decks. So that is everything with Niko, Light of Hope. Really cool commander. I was not really super interested in many cards from Duskmourn, like I mentioned, and I saw the magic, I saw the light that was Niko, and I was like, holy crap, this is my next deck tech. So here it is. I hope you all enjoy this deck. Try it out for yourself. Let me know how it works, and give me some suggestions. You know, we don't really have any new sets coming out for a while. I'm just kind of like going through my personal deck list a little bit here and like seeing what I think is fun, or you know, what I want to build. So yeah, that's kind of what I got going on. Thank you all so much for checking these videos out again. I mean, seriously, I never really expected much out of this, but it's awesome that people are responding to this and are interested. I love building decks. I love brewing. It's kind of my favorite thing to do in Magic. And I have a lot of decks. Personally, I'm sitting at probably like 70 or 100 or something like that. It's a lot. No proxies, nothing like that. All real cards. But I love building decks, and that's why I wanted to do this. And I like finding weird cards that people don't play with, because a lot of websites out there kind of homogenize deck building a little bit. Sure, I have some staples in this deck. I'm not even saying that I'm not guilty of that when building decks. You know, obviously, like, how many times do I put Swords of Plowshares and, you know, all that kind of removal in these decks? Pretty often. But, you know, I do try to, like, go outside that mold a little bit when I'm building decks. So hopefully you all enjoy that. Hopefully you enjoy the breakdowns of how I, you know, construct stuff and how to play it, because I think learning how to pilot decks is the most important thing about all this, you know, deck tech stuff, which a lot of people don't really do. You need to know how to play the deck, and I think that's really important, is breaking down how to play the deck, what to look out for, what cards to kind of keep in mind. And yeah, that's my spiel. Kind of rambled on there. We'll see you next time. I've been Wildcard MTG, and thank you so much.